art in the most fundamental way.
Thanks. Thank you, Anneliek and Daniel, for also inviting me here. And it's exciting. And I'm sorry I wasn't here really all the time, as I understand you started yesterday without me. And so I thought maybe first I wanted to emphasize the idea of doing things like this, where you bring people together who are, I guess, to a large extent, all members of a certain cultural sector. And I'm very curious to see how does these get-togethers evolve, and how does one apply the success or the ongoings of what is going on here onto the rest of the world to prevent the isolation or the sort of objectification of the conversations and the talks and the shared knowledge and all of that. So just as a beginning, I think we should acknowledge that we are all here, but to a large extent, I also think it is not necessarily only about being here, but it's also about how do we all apply what goes on here onto what we do afterwards, and see if we could all collectively sort of take whatever we bring from here and use it in our evaluations of how we conduct our lives, critically or not, afterwards, right? Because otherwise I think there's a tendency to maybe in a sort of celebratory manner to sort of kind of create these get-togethers, and then there is I wouldn't call it elitism, but a sort of isolationism, which might be counterproductive to the very course which is being discussed. So there is a sort of interest. I think it's an interesting argument to see how does one actually take what we are talking about and then apply it in how we then do our stuff, right? So that as a little introduction, I think that's an interesting topic. I don't have the solution to it, of course, but I just think raising it is maybe worthwhile. I'm also very happy to be talking on the back end of these great artists. Thank you so much for your talks. Very inspiring, because obviously things that are of great interest to me, and I understand that Dado gave a talk yesterday in which a work of art of mine, in which he has been very involved, appeared, and it's almost impossible, but I've been here for 8 hours, and I have not met Dado yet. Are you here, Dado? Oh, there you are, Dado. Okay, great. Oh, there you are. Here. And as you maybe noticed yesterday, it's very hard not to meet Dado. So I was surprised that we haven't said hi. Anyway, it's great. Thank you so much, Dado. People say that you spoke very nicely about the work, so I will try to create some balance in the equation by also shedding some light on where I'm coming from. So, I started from earlier on working with dematerialization of art. I was hoping to see that the dematerialization would offer a more agent-driven role to the person looking or engaging in art. So I had this assumption in art school that if I took away the objecthood, and this was then late 80s, early 90s, I could promote the importance of the engagement of the person being involved. Some people saw that as a kind of excuse to, like in the sort of in the immersiveness of that, as an excuse to kind of a utopian escapism, like getting away from the world. I go into art and I dream myself away from the real world, where I was on the contrary hoping that dematerialization would actually allow one to evaluate a certain set of questions that would otherwise be hard to evaluate. So it was not about escapism, it was not about disappearing. It was, I mean, it was interesting to hear about loss, right? But for me at that time, it was really more about claiming the role of the kind of the importance of the engaging person, and claiming that as a potential outset, which is why I started getting involved with phenomenology, through which I got closer to Daniel and his amazing work. But obviously also phenomenology led to a very strong focus on subjectivity, like it's very me, like phenomenology. Sorry, Daniel, but it's just very like me, experiencing everything. And I was gradually more and more interested in we instead of me. And I was very curious about how do we then introduce this notion that the person perceiving is not a consumer, like taking in, but in fact a producer. That was why I was so interested in this idea of experience as loss. And I thought that, yeah, I heard, it was like incredibly interesting. Ed. So I heard that yesterday you came up with the term. What was it? That you have forgotten. That you've forgotten the brain, the pre-internet brain, right? So actually, 2 days ago, I was with a pre-internet brain. Was that it, Douglas? So.
I missed that.
No, but I'm interested in it because I was very interested in. I worked with historians who were somehow working with prehistoric, or could you call it the formal medieval gardens, the apotheker sort of medicine gardens in the cloisters and so on. And that apparently was before perspective. And the claim is, of course, that the people architecturally, spatially involved, they can't see it the way they saw it because perspective then came later and they ruined what the monks at the time saw, because perspective then introduced a whole new system and they, in a sense, lost it, right? They got blind, you could claim. And that is, I think, what is going on all the time. And in that sense, losing things can be quite productive, becoming blind can be productive, as it also means recalibration of our senses. Just hold on to that, because I think a number of the talks was to a large extent about this idea, well, do I actually acknowledge that with sensing the world comes a degree of responsibility? Do I, in the way I see the world, also co-produce it or produce it or share the narrative to the extent of me having a role which we could call authorship? And that I think is incredibly interesting because it suggests that becoming blind is actually seeing things. I wouldn't say again, but I was just say seeing things. Like being blind is actually seeing things. And it was addressed very briefly that this notion that a work of art maybe could be considered an idea that has not yet been thought, arriving to us, and maybe from the future. So the idea that we are kind of on the move, like this place and this Art Summit in Verbier is like a trajectory and not a point. So we are traveling in time and we are kind of meeting up over as we travel with an idea, which to a great extent is maybe not articulated, maybe not verbalized, formulated. Maybe it has a degree of emotional affordance, and it is meeting us on its trajectory. So it's a meeting up which creates the idea which could create a work of art, which is an idea that Timothy Morton brought up. It's the kind of meeting up. I think he took it for Dorian Massey, but it brings in all these people, Van Eyck or Latour's idea of Lovelock's Gaia, introducing all this sort of recomposition of are we as humans the most sort of important biological, should I say, object, Morton, I guess, or non-object, and so on. Last time Daniel and I was together was in Stockholm with Timothy Morton on object-oriented, and it was as confusing as your talk, Ed, but incredibly inspiring. So altogether, really brilliant. Okay, so let me get to a few of the thoughts. So I came to VR and the technology thing through my interest in the relationship between embodied knowledge, muscle memory, psychosocial therapeutic systems, most of which is psychotherapeutic, and in that I started working with behavioral change. How do we experience things that are likely to instrumental us or to give us the sense of our actions having consequences, leading to us changing our behavior? I was very interested in this. Whether does the cultural sector also have a sort of an application to our society? Does it actually do anything? Which I don't doubt, but it would be interesting to examine a little bit, especially when it comes to critical theory. How do we then apply critical theory onto action, and how do we apply action onto society? Which is why I sort of started with this point. Is this applicable? And I started working with, let me see if I have a few works. Let's just straight to the film. How does motoric activity influence our cognitive memory? So as you can see here, a lot of people are physical active in a very non-hierarchical way. And this is actually in a museum. And if you think about what goes on in museums, generally the motoric dimension of museum behavior points to a few facts, such as we all move with as if we don't have a body, or at least we don't refer to the body movement as a co-producing element when looking at art. And we also maybe underestimate the fact that the museum is to a large extent a controlling institution that prevents us from even reconsidering movement and how we experience art. Maybe laying down or crawling around is a better way to look at a Donald Judd, for instance, right? So a Donald Judd actually looks really interesting when laying down for obvious reasons. So, and in that sense, I think there should be days in museums in which different types of movement is encouraged. None of these suggestions were successful. Let me just go to the first slide, which was this one. Oops, sorry. Oh my God. And this piece, this. Let's just for 1 second go into it. This is the Tate Modern Turbine Hall 14 years ago. So what you had is a mirror in the ceiling and a little bit of haze, so mirror and smoke, basically, smoke and mirrors, and half a disk of a sun, other half is in the mirror. But what I thought was interesting was a small sequence of questions. Would I allow for an opportunity? Could I create a kind of hospitality through which people were so engaged in their reading of the space that they were not so busy with controlling each other? It's just not very easy, but it's a theoretical experiment that comes from analyzing public space, a very Danish, Norwegian experiment on how does public space actually host people in a sharing way without controlling people, utopian or not. But so out of thinking, how do I bring Tate Modern out of its legacy of being, I wouldn't call it very corporate, but driven into a more private sector type of ideology, into a more public sector type of thinking. Public sector suggesting that the museum space is actually closer to the street than it is to the museum. So museology is evolving in what we could say an embodiment pacifying way, where I would like to see the idea of public space being offering the museums an opportunity to host physical activity, amplifying the reading of the work, as we have seen in a lot of the other experiences. So this is a field of interest. And if you just think of it, what happens when you go in is, you establish, something glowing at the other end, kind of looks like a sun. Narrative is established very fast, or even children, like totally less than a second, people say, okay, it's a sun. Then you start to go like, this space looks different. So there's a discrepancy between what you expect and what you see. Then you start to say, this looks like a mirror. It's all like within the 2 or 3 first seconds. And then you say, in the mirror I see people. I wonder where I am. So almost unanimously, people, they went in, they first, okay, sun, they started walking. And Herzog Dömer, who designed the space, they were very smart. They made a ramp at the beginning of the space. So a lot of people, they were like kind of, disembodied, re-embodied, right? What is that French? There's a famous magazine about Les Obliques. Claude Parent was a student, but the older French one was and Rencolas, they did this magazine, and Les Obliques came out of Virilio, about when you walk and you constantly have to recompose your body, you are more present. It's like the chicken in Kentucky, right? Always wind. The chicken, they always walk like this. And on a wind-still day, they are totally super alert because they fall over, because they're so used to the wind. They never had no wind. So Virilio brought up this point that physical attention is something that can be very easily activated, and a number of ideas like that. So nevertheless, ramp, you come in. So in the process of being decomposed almost physically, muscle-wise, you are looking for yourself. It's a very productive combination, and so on and so forth. So one can go in and revisit the museum by simply describing very precisely, because the first thing then, once you found yourself, you say, that is me. Now, what do I do? And then people started doing like this, and then they see another person, and then they say, oh, I better check if the person is there. Oh, there it is. I can see the other person. So there was a very strong sort of collective, and then the other person did like this, and then you start to do more. So you use the mirror and so on and so forth, right? So do you see there is a whole sequence of social interactive components which I was very interested in. Not all of them I had foreseen, but the opportunity was still for me to host the possibility of whether it's the unforeseen or whether it's more like a recalibration of how does body, muscle, memory, and cognition actually work together. So this has been a theme. I have 4 works. I will just take 2 of them. And so this is actually the Louisiana Museum, which was just mentioned, a really amazing museum north of Copenhagen. Moderne Museum is also not so bad, but this is really... So anyway, so this is a riverbed in Iceland. So this is actually a camera on the foot. So riverbed in Iceland, to some extent about the same. You're destabilized, and you go like, oh, this is a mudslide. This is threatening the museum. Or you go, oh, this is a contemplative garden. I can actually relax. I can take it easy. And the people who are destabilized and the people who feel, should I say, consolidated, they don't exclude each other. So one of the points at the Louisiana Museum is, and that is very ingrained in the museological sort of agenda, is hospitality. Do we feel included or excluded? Am I good enough to go to a museum? I'm not looking at the painting as long as this person. Maybe I should stand a little longer? Am I uncertain? Do I feel welcome? Do I feel, oh, I'm too stupid for this? I'm not welcome, you know? And museums, obviously, there's a whole discussion right there. And this, I think, was a nice exercise in a space where it was actually okay to disagree. So in terms of sort of democracy, idealism is maybe an argument to say, well, what spaces successfully hosts the idea of the other, or the idea of the person disagreeing? And as we know, with current times being obsessed with political populism and nationalism and decreasing we-ness, I'm very curious about to what extent does some artistic agendas foster the inclusion of the disagreeing component or disagreeing person. And in that sense, I was very interested in the museum, which on one side is really a fantastic institution with a great legacy as a history, but on the other side it's also very elitist, and to a great extent a challenging institution, because the demography of the people who come there are, you could call it relatively mono something, right? Anyway, see, so I'm coming towards the end here. The things that I've been curious about, this is a public space, has been to what extent does what we know actually divert from how we do, what we do. And the thing is, obviously we know a lot. We kind of know it all now with the internet. And I will get to the internet in a second. There's no place where there's not access to everything, almost, right? And still, the way we act is very often as if we did not know. So we have access to knowledge, and one good example is, of course, the climate, or how we deal with migrants, for instance. There's lots of things where we know from a moral, from an ethical, from a sort of a kind of civic, societal point of view, how one would be navigating should one land in that situation. And now we are in that situation, and then we still don't navigate accordingly, right? So the discrepancy between knowing and doing seems to be a bit larger. And obviously sometimes it also takes sometimes it's valid to check whether what we know is in fact what we physically feel. So this experiment, which was a glacial ice for Greenland, which was sent to Paris during the COP in 2.5 years ago, the COP in Paris with the Paris treatment and so on. So glacial ice, lots of things to be said and all of that. But one thing which is interesting is that people, they look from a distance and they go, oh, it's ice. Very easy, long time. And then they walk over to it And besides the eyes being really amazingly cracking, beautiful, and so on, so they still look at them and say, look at all this, look at these small black dots, and man, is there any insects in there? Oh no, maybe not, because the eyes and the ice age and so on. And then they put their hand on it, and they go, oh my God, it's really cold. And obviously, they knew, or everybody knows, I wonder if I have the cold image here. Yeah, that's the cold image, you know. And the idea, and it's not quite as didactic as it sort of sounds, but the idea that actually touching the eyes is a whole different register than brain-wise and body-wise and so on, than thinking about touching the eyes. And sometimes you even have, when you stand there, you have to say, try to touch it, because people just stand and they just like look at it as if it was an iPad. And it's very interesting because it's just interesting what happens and so on. Anyway, so when I started with Dado on the VR project, I was very interested in this tangible element, which is obviously the hardest part. But if we think about it, there's a lot of tangible components. One is, of course, you have a headset on, right? It's kind of heavy. And if you think about it, you know, there's a lot of tangibility. It's just not directly yet connected to what you see. There's that very confusing thing that when you look down on yourself, if you will experience it later, you see you don't have a body. So it's really, and you don't have hands, unless you have these things in your hand, right? But your arm is not visible, you just see like something at the end. So with regards to registering what's going on, there is a lot of things, but they are not necessarily yet so strongly connected to the narrative of the artwork. And we then discussed, and together with Daniel actually, I said, let's dematerialize it again. Let's drive the narrative of close to nothing, sort of a bit of water, mist, and a rainbow, which is another work I did a long time back. Let's see if we take away everything, the felt sense of presence might be amplified, even with regards to having no body, and how then to challenge that. Something that I haven't sorted out yet. There is another interesting component. We haven't really found out how do you deal with the fact that when I have the glasses on, I wonder how I look. Obviously, people, they never seem to have this problem, but I am always, when I wear the glasses, I go like, oh God, they're looking at, I look really stupid. And probably that's not a major issue, because soon everybody's going to be wearing them all the time, and then nobody can see anybody. But generally speaking, I also think there is an element of, you know, like in the museum, there's a sort of element of yet not verbalized social control with regards to, do I sit in a museum with these glasses and people walk by and they just go like, this guy is not aware that we are looking at him. So I'm very interested in that because the interactive, and I do find that quite a challenge, and I haven't sorted that out yet. But that's how we got started with introducing sharing the space in the internet. So the one version we're working on now, Dado and I, is the fact that we can have more people, and as Dado, I believe, described. And the interesting is, obviously, I can be with my son, who is currently in Denmark, in that same space, and we can even have a conversation, not yet, but soon. And so on and so forth. So there's obviously an interesting challenge, but there's also the fact that I think for my son to make better choices in life, he, I think, will benefit from having a physical relationship with me. And I might be a old-fashioned kind of moralizing guy, if you ask my son, especially. But quite fundamentally, I do think there is a sort of challenge with the disembodiment and the idea of a moral compass, being obviously incredibly modern in that sense. Just finally, with regards to the VR, I really think of it more as a language with which one can say things. So I wasn't really worried when starting with VR whether it's going to ruin or it's going to do a lot or something. For me, it's just like, okay, so I can draw with a pen and a pencil. There's one leg, I take a picture. It's another language. I can speak French if I could, but so that's another language. So there's all these languages. Now there's this VR. That just, like the pen doesn't have colors, right? But the VR doesn't have a body yet. So now the challenge is, or the issue is for us artists, for instance, to come up with a critical inquiry that would allow for the for introducing the moral compass into that set of rules. The VR itself is changing so fast that the first ideas I had, it does not really apply. Obviously soon the headset is so small that I'm not gonna experience it, right? So soon it's not even gonna be on my head. It's just somehow in these glasses or something. So it's a really interesting journey. And if the industry which was brought up doesn't eclipse any cultural potential, which might very well be, especially considering the scale of the porn industry or the gaming industry, which are so massive. I do see, a bit of rupture from that side. I also see the fact that my son potentially could just like disappear, like suddenly gone on one side. But I also see that doctors are training, like what do you call it? Emergent surgency, like so a soldier gets shot and then immediately you have to surgeon. So they're training that on VR with great success rates, much bigger than training on pigs. My argument was, the pig is actually there. They cut up a pig, like in Tel Aviv. Pig, it's two together. World record 6 seconds to save a pig, which is the best, soldier war surgeons, like stitching. And on VR, it actually works. So maybe there's some hope. Not that I'm pro, sewing up. Well, I am pro sewing up, but you get the point, right? So there might be some use. My psychologist suggests doing the therapy session in VR, which I have introduced this. But doesn't the body actually matter? And she said, "Oh yeah, you're right. Yeah, can't forget that." So, and because she's very much like a body person, but it's so interesting. Anyway, I'm at the end of this. I'm at the end of this. Yes, I'm just checking. It was so inspiring. So thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.